All right, so welcome everyone and greetings as always to another Sabbath Insight. Of course, I am Chief Yuya, Chief Jegna of the ANU Nation and head priest of the ANU Life Global Ministries. By title, you can see that we're speaking about the morning after and specifically distinguishing between the false dawn and the morning. You know, before morning comes, typically there's a dawn, and dawning is like just a thin sort of deceptive light, if you will, that breaks through darkness. But it doesn't necessarily bring like the warmth of the sun. So like you could say good dawning because you start to see that spark, of a new day, of the sunlight coming. But, like it may not have warmed up yet. Many of you who camp, you may be familiar with that when you know that sun is coming and it's like you're trying to warm up, if you're winter camping or camping in cooler weather. So dawn announces the coming of illumination, but dawn is not necessarily said illumination. It's the gray hour between blindness and sight, or between your sleep and your awakening. When you read the book of Coming Forth by Day, often called the Book of the Dead incorrectly, it talks about an initiate who travels every night, right? And they travel through the Duat or the underworld, and they strive to rise in the dawning with Ra. So it's not the actual sunrise that brings them forth. That's not what makes the initiate come forth. It's the coming forth by day, by the title. So what that phrase can sort of be translated to understand is that in order for you to awaken in truth, you have to pass through shadows. You have to pass through the night, or illusions. And what happens is you emerge with a new alignment and you're aligned with the light of divine order, or in the case of the book of Coming Forth by Day, the light of Ma'at. So within our own experiences and our own journeys, there's always a difference between the dawn and a difference between the morning, right? Dawn is your awareness. Dawn is that first sort of flicker of consciousness, that something has to change, and the morning is your obedience. It's the alignment. It's the moment that you do actually rise up, that you are transformed and repositioned and sort of correlated with divine law. So a lot of people never make it past the dawn. They never make it past the spark, and they oftentimes will mistake awareness for awakening. They'll confuse their strength of conviction with actually being converted to truth. Some people will feel the light of understanding, but they'll even maybe call it, but they never step into the work of actual deliverance, which is renewal. The work of deliverance is actually renewal. So that's kind of where the 7 deadly sins live, in that space between dawn and morning, Now, this segment is going to be a great one. I'm just going to say that, however you receive it, I'm telling you, it's a great one. I was thinking about how I was going to do this one, this dawning. Usually the shadows before Sabbath is when I start to reflect. I go into my very slow space and I think, okay, what is it? What's supposed to come, for Sabbath insight? And this came and I was like, that's kind of it's a big topic, and I'm like, I don't really know how I'm going to deliver that one because there's a lot to it, there's a lot to this particular topic. So I'm going to do my best. I'm going to do my best. I'll say that. And if it's something that you really value and appreciate, then maybe I could break it up, or I'm a series person, like how I've done the Jezebel series and different series, and the mating series and stuff. So it can possibly be broken up if it's something that you find value in. But when we talk about the seven deadly sins, those are the shadows that are whispers that say, stay over here because the light is just too strong, and they feed off of the false freedom that comes before repentance. There's a pleasure a lot of times that we feel that precedes the pain of realization, and those indulgences, like your indulgence, it feels like the dawn, that sort of bright, liberating and alive feeling. But, until really you come into the morning, a morning arrives. In the morning, it demands truth. The dawn doesn't demand truth. So when you're walking through the false dawn, you start to believe I'm free. I got the spark. And that's the trick that it makes you believe. Like, when you're in the dawning, like I'm free, so you speak your mind, I'm expressing myself. You take whatever you want in life. You feel whatever it is that you crave. And for the moment, it feels like a resurrection, but as the real morning starts to draw near, you start to see what you've become, that same light that sort of promised you freedom now is showing you like, yo, I'm in chains. It's revealing chains to you. The same fire that made you feel alive at one point now shows you that you're actually standing in ashes. You've just burnt everything down. You think about Hawa and Adoma in the garden, and it's the sort of ecstasy they probably experienced when they first took in the da'at, or the fruit as it's named. But then they looked and they felt ashamed because morning came, and it's like, oh, what did we just do? We just ruined everything. So that's the morning after. That's sort of the place where illusion begins to die, and truth begins to sort of speak to you. And just as the soul in the book of coming forth by day had to name and conquer each serpent before it could rise with the sun, it's the same way that we have to face our own serpents in our life. And um, we have seven serpents, many of us, or what they call seven sins or seven deadly sins that we have to deal with before we can come forth by day. So the false dawn, it's always going to flatter you. It in particular, it tends to flatter the eye. In the morning, it tends to heal the soul. So one promises you light, and the other one, the presence of light. So I'm not beginning. We're talking about sins. I'm not beginning with condemnation, but more so with clarity, because every false dawn that deceived us at some point, it's just an invitation to rise in the right way, to be reborn in the right way, to walk in the actual true morning of divine order. So let's start with the first one. Many people are aware of when we talk about the seven deadly sins: pride. And like I said, this is going to be a great segment. I feel it. I know it. So just make sure you tune in at the level that you should tune in so that you don't miss anything. I would just say that share, if it really does something for you. Comment, of course. Oh, and hit like. I know like is important for the algorithm and stuff like that, but what's important for me is that you each one teach seven. Go out, and if you get something of value, share something of value. All right, so let's go to pride. Now, pride, that's the dominion of Gadriel. It's the fall before your funeral. Every sin that you deal with in life, it has a ruler. It has a consciousness, we'll say, that governs it. So pride, you might look at it as like it's a feeling, but it's not just a feeling. Pride itself is a throne, and it's seated on by Gadriel, or the wall of Elohim. That's what Gadriel could mean, the wall of Elohim. That's the one who once guarded the garden and then guided Adoma and Hawa into their fall. So in the book of Enoch, you have Gadriel, and Gadriel is named as one of the watchers, the one who led Eve astray, teaching the art of adornment and intoxication and of self-image. So Gadriel's crime wasn't just lust of the body, but of lust of self-perception. So Gadriel taught humanity how to appear divine without actually having to be divine, without actually having to go through the work. So that's what pride does for us today. That's what it does. It teaches us how to perform holiness instead of embodying holiness. It gives us those sort of performative sort of skills and techniques. So the false dawn of pride, it feels like freedom, because Gadriel will start to flatter you, or like we say in the Quran, it's a soft whisper. And he'll whisper like, you don't need counsel because you are the counsel. You don't need correction. You're the truth. Things like that, where people say, I'm listening to my Ori, I'm listening to my spirit. I don't have to listen to you. I don't listen to this elder or read this book. I'm listening to me. That's Gadriel. And so like Eve, who was looking on the shimmer of this forbidden fruit, if we will, mistook reflection for revelation. So a lot of times when we're in that realm, we think we're rising up, but it's the same illusion that deceived the morning star. So Gadriel's gift is illumination without obedience. It's light without source, or having a brilliance but not having any balance. So in that state, you feel untouchable. You feel enlightened. You feel like you're living above the fray. You can quote scripture, but you don't bow to the instruction of the scripture. You can lead other people, but you refuse to be led. And as soon as you're not serving Elohim, you're serving Gadriel. So Gadriel feeds on independence, on subtle rebellions, that hide beneath intellect, um, that hide beneath ambition. Sometimes we're aware of the little subtle micro rebellions or aggressions that people wage, and it starts to show the dominion that they serve. When pride takes root inside of a person, then Gadriel becomes that person's invisible master. So they start defending their image instead of defending their integrity. They start to chase being right more than they chase being righteous, and I would say the moment that you sort of place your will above the divine order, you've entered into the sanctum, if you will, of Gadriel. Gadriel will definitely give you power, um, momentary power, but magnetic, seductive sort of power. You'll start to receive, people are going to admire your confidence. They're going to applaud your boldness. Man, you just speak your mind. You're just out there. You're just living your life. You'll look like light, but you'll sound like thunder that's in a temple that wasn't even built for you. That's a deception. Pride feels like ascension, but the higher you climb up under Gadriel's guidance, the further you fall from Elohim's grace. You see? So there's a death. One of the things that I'm going to sort of hit on, throughout this is that each of these deadly sins brings a certain death, physical, spiritual, mental, whatever. Pride brings a spiritual death. It's not instant though. It's a progressive spiritual death. The first thing that dies in you is your humility. Your ability to receive instruction. Then after that dies, then your gratitude dies. Your ability to recognize when you're receiving grace, that begins to die. Then your empathy dies. Your empathy is your ability to feel for others. And then finally, your obedience will die. Your ability to hear the voice of the divine Elohim, so you become self-referential. You become a universe that's orbiting around your own reflection. You only refer to yourself. Gadriel doesn't need you to worship him with like songs and candles and ebos. He just needs you to believe in your own divinity more than you believe in Elohim's sovereignty. That's like the key. That's the way you get in. So that's pretty much how angels fall. That's how you create, a fallen angel. Not necessarily from heaven, but they fall from harmony. That's the thing. We always had this picture of angels falling out of the sky, but really they're falling from harmony. So there has to be a return to sort of balance. But even in death, mercy still waits. This is a possibility for it. In the book of Coming Forth by Day, the soul has to pass through 12 gates, right? And the soul passes through these 12 gates to reach Ra's presence. And one of them is guarded by a being of arrogance. And only those who bow may pass. So humility becomes like a key to resurrection. So to defeat Gadriel, cursing Gadriel doesn't really do anything. To defeat Gadriel, you have to starve Gadriel. So every act of surrender becomes like an exorcism. You know what, man, I was wrong. Or sister, or whatever, I was wrong. And that becomes like a sword against the dominion of Gabriel. Every Elohim, guide me. I don't know what I'm doing. That starts to restore the architecture of your soul. So proud people will serve Gadriel and they'll call it growth. And the humble people will serve Elohim and they'll become the light that they once tried to imitate. You see? So pride itself, man, the freedom of pride is a counterfeit sort of freedom. It's a light that burns without any warmth, like the dawn. It becomes this sort of throne for you that elevates you, but it won't sustain you. So if you're going to walk in a true morning, you have to dethrone Gadriel. You have to reclaim obedience as strength in your life and humility as power in your life. The dawn of pride is brilliance, but the morning after is the actual burial. If you bow before the actual true sun, you'll rise with the true sun. So that's the essence of pride. Now let's get into envy. One of the other sins. Envy, that's the green flame serpent, So it's the sin that a lot of sages in the East talked about. They called it the poison of the mind, or poisons of the mind. In Buddhist teaching, it was called Ursya. In Ursya, that was the jealousy that arises when another person's virtue or another person's fortune awakens our own insecurity. And the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna talks about it and calls it one of the gates to hell. Krishna says that it's born of lust and anger and of greed. So, and then you have like in our Taoist traditions, the Tao talks about the green dragon, right? And the green dragon guards the eastern wind, and it symbolizes envy, but it also symbolizes renewal. So it's a vital force that if you leave it uncontrolled, it will devour itself. It's the thing about envy. Envy is not only an emotion as we look at it. Envy is an elemental imbalance. It's when you have an imbalance inside of yourself. That's why envy in our Eastern forms, it belongs to the wood element, and this the season of spring, wood in spring. So that's the time when life pushes up. It's seeking life is seeking light, in the spring. So when that upward energy becomes blocked, that same vitality that should create new growth, and it turns to resentment. So the tree begins to twist around itself. you know the liver is your organ for detoxification, cleansing, and most importantly, direction. But your liver will start to overheat. Your eyes, which are seat of your vision, they start to get red. That's why, like, you listen to, like, ancient sort of Chinese or older Chinese philosophy. It says that envy is the heat that blinds. You know, so it's a spirit that rides the current, of what we call the East, or what we call the green Mara. And green Mara is a tempter that feeds on comparison. Green Mara will start to whisper that the balance is unfair. That harmony is favoritism. You know, and that your destiny is to stir, is distribute, but it's being distributed unevenly, or unequally. Like, this one got more. Everything's in harmony, but no, it's not. It's not harmonious. It's someone is being shown favoritism. That's right. That's not right. So when you start to believe green Mara in this sense, your chi, it begins to turn inward. And once your chi turns inward, what should have been a flow now becomes a friction. So you start to feel that inward chi as gossip, as a quiet competition, as irritation. You feel your very soul rubbing against its own bones. You know, um, envy is like a storm. Excuse me, I was holding back a sneeze. Um, Envy it's like it's when the liver of the world is just sort of in chaos. So the only thing that will cool that storm, or calm that overactive liver, is gratitude. Gratitude begins to cool it down. So when you start to kill, or death of envy sort of comes, it's an energetic, or energetic uprising. When envy's death comes, like, the wood element begins to burn, right? And your heart fire, it starts to dim. So all of your love that you even offer to another individual, it becomes calculation, and your compassion just becomes a critique. So you're alive at that point, but nothing is growing. That's the death of envy. Like, when envy is bringing death. Your relationships will just sort of wilt like old flowers, because you keep measuring sunlight instead of sharing sunlight. Um, and our alchemical systems, like every system, whether it's Vedic, or it's a Taoist system, or it's a Kemetic system, it's sort of the same sort of um, antidote to the problem: reverence. And Kemetic system, it's aligning with Ma'at, and the Gita, it's Bhakti, as we say. Bhakti is devotion without any demands. In the and the Taoist system, we have Wu Wei. Wu Wei is action without struggle. So when envy comes, it's best not to fight envy. It will just get bigger. The best thing to do is to transmute envy. Turn the sight of another's fortune or another's blessing into a mirror for potential. You can breathe right down into your liver when you start to get that feeling of envy and enviousness. And you just say, like, may fortune flow. And And more importantly, like, may their fortune flow. Like, you see someone you envy, may their fortune flow. And through that flow, may I learn balance. It's one of the most powerful things you could do when you feel that green dragon start to feel. So now that green flame turns into a jade light, but it's a cool, you had this hot green flame in you before, but now it turns into this cool jade light. It's still vibrant, but now it's healing you instead of consuming you. The false dawn of envy, it has this sort of emerald glow, if you will. But it's not giving off any warmth, So the true morning turns that same hue into a growth. So when you're envious, you're stagnant. You're going to stagnate as a result. But when you begin to admire others, you begin to evolve. When you choose admiration, green Mara begins to retreat. That Leviathan sort of kind of uncoils, and the wood that was of your spirit, it stretches now towards the sun once again. So if you bless what you behold, and you will find yourself beholding a blessing. So you come forth by day rooted in what's upright, and being verdant. So let's go to wrath, because I'm talking about fire. Wrath is a fire that also consumes its holder. But you got to understand that all fires begin as a light, right? So wrath in its first spark is holy. It's born of the instinct to protect what you consider to be sacred. That's where wrath comes from. But when that spark loses its guidance, it becomes like this a fork of ruin. Like a pitchfork. I'm thinking like Frankenstein, or like the torch. It becomes like a torch that just ruins things. A great example of that is if you look at the Netir, Neteru Sekhmet. Sekhmet was created out of the eye of Ra to punish rebellion among mankind. And she drank blood as water. And she would roar, she was a lioness, and it would just kind of shake the whole earth and heavens. But when at one point, someone gave her red beer. Red beer was like an illusion of blood. And her rage started to subside. And then the more her rage subsided, she turned back into Het Heru, the gentle one, if you didn't know they're the same, Netir. So that's a cycle that every soul sort of goes through. There's an anger burn, and divinity turned the destroyer, until compassion now cools that flame, In the Vedic, you have the force Agni, Agni. And Agni is the sacrificial fire. Agni carries offerings upward, to the deities. But if the altar of Agni is not kept clean or unkept by the priest, he scorches the priest. So that's sort of how wrath works inside of us, right? We have this fuel for justice. And when it's tended properly, it becomes justice. But when it's neglected, it becomes a wildfire. So righteous anger, it defends blind. It defends, but blind anger devours. I always say when people say, "Oh man, you're angry." Well, not to me, but because most people don't know I am angry. But this person's angry. There's nothing wrong with anger. It's like, what kind? Is it righteous anger or is it blind anger? If it's righteous anger, it's going to defend something that's sacred. But if it's blind anger, it's going to devour something that's sacred. So at first, wrath always feels like clarity. It always feels like clarity. You can almost see it in people's eyes when they go into a rage. Sometimes you see that the eyes open up like, and at that moment, or that sort of split moment, everything false seems obvious to you, because you feel so powerful. You feel so awake in that moment. You feel unstoppable, right? So that's the false dawn of flame. It's heat without any control. As soon as the fire leaves the altar, if you will, uh, it begins to eat the temple. So when wrath governs you, you're no longer serving Elohim. You're serving the God of retribution. Um, and one thing about it, the God of retribution always hides behind a very noble phrase. You know this phrase. They had it coming. So that God convinces you that the destruction is purification. And for a moment, it feels good. It feels divine. You break what you consider to be unjust, but the problem is you keep breaking, long after the justice has been done. So that deity's hunger, you'll start to realize, is endless, right? So his name is spoken like different cultures, of course. You have the Mara, who they also call the flaming mouth. You have Sekhmet, but unbound Sekhmet. It's not just regular Sekhmet, Sekhmet unbound. In the psychological field, we call that trauma unhealed. When you hear that phrase, trauma unhealed, it's talking about Sekhmet. So whatever you call it, it's this demand is to feed me peace. It's fed on peace, and there's a death that it brings. It's a relational and energetic death. Like I told you, every sin brings its own death. So when wrath rules, you burn bridges in your life faster than you can build them. You fracture families. Your breath is short all the time. You don't breathe properly. Your nervous system only knows war as its main language. Even your immune system your immune system starts to collapse. So, because the body can't live inside of fire forever, so you become a furnace without any offering, or a smoke without signal. Um, every fire has two destinies: to either consume or to consecrate. So when anger starts to arise, treat it like Agni, offer truth to it. Ask the anger, I feel the flame. What are you trying to protect? And direct that heat towards creation. Build something, write something, pray if you pray, forge something. If you march, go on a march, channel Sekhmet back into Het Haru. Let that passion become healing. Breathe through your nose, exhale through your mouth until your heat turns to a pulse, into a rhythm. You can always picture that flame like sort of descending from the head to the heart and then to the navel, because that's where your purpose lives, inside of your navel. Now it's not wrath anymore. It's will. You've turned wrath into will. Anger is sacred. Anger is sacred, but it's only sacred when it becomes light for the lost, and instead of, burning down the innocent. The book of Coming Forth by Day says, I have not caused pain in one of the negative confessions. It doesn't say I have not felt anger. Even the Necharu felt anger. It says you have not become your pain, right? So the false dawn of wrath, it blinds you. But the true morning of wrath, it forges you into something else. One leaves nothing but ashes and the other leaves gold, So you got to guard that inner altar, man. You got to feed your fire only with purpose. Never feed it with pride, and when the sun of Elohim starts to rise up inside of you, you'll burn with radiant will, as opposed to burning with rage. All right. Sloth is the other deadly sin. That's like a silent decay, sloth. Remember, there was a primordial sea before anything started moving. We called that noon. It was limitless. It was silent. And it was just waiting for a command. That stillness was great potential. It wasn't paralysis. It was stillness. But when stillness begins to forget its purpose, it becomes a sleep of the soul. With noon becomes holy because it responds when Ra speaks. Motion begins, good motion, only when the word of creation stirs the waters. So when the world is ignored, the abyss sort of just remains. It's heavy, it's dark, it's unmoving, and that becomes a territory of sloth. It's stillness without direction. When you're waiting for something that never intends to rise. I know in like more Kushite or Indus Kush philosophy, there's an inertia that they call tamas, one of the three gunas or qualities of nature, if you will. And tamas is like necessary for regeneration and it's necessary for rest. But when it dominates, your consciousness begins to sink, right? So the mind becomes like a fog. The body becomes very heavy, and the spirit becomes indifferent. A person who is ruled by Thomas will always say, "Tomorrow I'm gonna. Tomorrow I will. I was getting to that, but tomorrow never comes. I was gonna, it just stays there because they've mistaken comfort for peace. At first it starts to feel very freeing, if you will. There's no pressure, there's no expectations, kuna matata, right? The false dawn of sloth is very soft, and it tells you that rest is your resistance, that when you're disengaging from things, it's because you're more enlightened. So you delay, you scroll, you justify it. But as the true morning starts to draw closer, you start to feel the weight. Man, my projects are unfinished. I was supposed to make salat and I didn't. I was supposed to grow and I postponed it. So that water that once kind of cooled you has become now a swamp. In the East, that stagnation is personified by Kuba Hakana, excuse me. That's this giant who slept through seasons of purpose and would only wake up to go feed and then return back to dreaming. So a lot of times, like in our daily life, that giant appears as distraction. Distraction is the subtle God of comfort. It's always whispering, just stay. You've earned your rest. Just you've earned this. It doesn't demand any sort of worship or anything. It just demands delay. That's how you invoke that God, through delay. Every time you postpone an act of obedience, it's like lighting incense on the altar of that deity. So there's a death that it brings, and it brings a death of purpose. Sloth brings a death of purpose because what dies first is your momentum, right? That your momentum is your sacred rhythm that keeps you in sync with divine timing. So clarity begins to die. That means your vision is getting dull, and then desire begins to rot. You're not wanting change anymore. You only wish for change, but you don't really want it. Your faith starts to fade. And it's not because Elohim has left you. It's because you stop moving towards the place where revelation actually waits for you. So in the world of psychology, we call that avoidant coping. And avoidant coping is when you're like trading small pleasures for meaningful effort. Spiritually, it's the death of will. You're alive, but for days, you're just no longer echoing in eternity. So to heal that sloth, to start trying to address it, like you have to sanctify your motion. Every morning and dawning, just choose one act that disrupts the inertia. Whether you say a prayer or an affirmation out loud, or you go sweep your floors, right? You go answer a message or text or something that you just been kind of putting off, or email. The moment movement returns, noon becomes creation again. So Tama starts to transform into the karma that we need. So because your actions are now aligned with the purpose. And now Valley, understanding, we speak about the Ka, which is another word for work, but it's spirit. To work rightly is to move your spirit through form, your Ka. So when you act in obedience, the false deity of comfort starts to starve. Your soul starts to learn the rest and completion, not in avoidance. Rest is sacred when it follows labor. Sabbath is a sacred day that you guard because it follows labor, but it's deadly when rest replaces labor. I did a song called Rise in relation to that. So even if only in like small gestures, each one is a wave that sort of starts to push the waters of noon towards light. Even if it's soft, the false dawn of sloth, it feels like peace. But when you're really in the true morning, it reveals that you're really paralyzed. So when you start to awaken, you start to remember that motion is your prayer. All right, let's get to greed. It's an important one. Greed is a hunger that devours. That's one or the other. I don't know what number we're up to now, as far as the deadly sin. But greed is it's the oldest hunger, I would say, in creation. It's a serpent that swallows its own tail. You see that in our Yoruba symbolism. Of course, in our ancient Chinese symbolism, dragons eating its own tail. The eja, or the fish that has its tail in its mouth. In Nile Valley, we had Apep. Apep was a devourer who tries every night to consume the sun. And in the East, that force is called Lopa. Lopa is one of the three fires. Lopa binds the soul to rebirth. So Lopa has an appetite that can never taste enough. It has a breath that sort of expands, but it never exhales. So greed begins as a need. A child reaches for something, a spirit desires something. And that's a very natural thing. But when desire escapes discipline, it becomes your God, and it becomes a God that demands endless offerings. You start to believe that more is the same as safe, so more food, more social media followers, more possessions, more proof that I matter. The stomach feels itself, but the ache is still there. So that ache is not lack for anything. It's the feeling, what it feels like when you're so distant from your purpose. So in the Vedic view, you had Lopa, and Lopa burns in the belly chakra, which is your seat of survival. So when balance, that fire that's there, it digests your experiences into wisdom. But when it's unbalanced, it eats through the walls of all your contentment, and it only leaves you with cravings. So it's pretty much the same story, right, across the systems. If you're looking at APEP, APEP lives beneath the Nile, the Ravana and Lanka. You have the dragon that's guarding gold, always consuming what they should be protecting, because at first greed feels like a momentum. It feels like an ambition. It feels like progress. It feels like efficiency even. And you tell yourself, man, I'm building a legacy, man, generational wealth. I'm building something. But the false dawn of greed always disguises itself as stewardship every time. By the time the morning comes, you start to realize that you've built an empire that requires your soul as the rent. You know, when greed is reigning over you, you're not serving the Elohim, or the provider. You're serving Mammon. You know, you measure your worth by your possessions. That temple it's like 7-Eleven. It's open 24 hours a day, and the worship chant is, I deserve, I need, you know, people locked into that God will never say enough. They can't, because they survive only by convincing themselves that they're empty. So that God has to always tell you, you're empty, you're empty. You hungry? You hungry? You need more? You need more? So the death that comes from greed is moral death. First your integrity dies because corners are cut. Then empathy, people become resources to you. And then finally your peace dies, because the constant reaching never gives your heart an opportunity to rest. You're rich in things and then you're poor in meaning. So it's kind of like APEP. You devour the very light that you're chasing, uh, and psychology, we call that hedonic adaptation, where each reward, uh, it shrinks as soon as you obtain it, So spiritually, it's the death of satisfaction, the erasing, I would say, of gratitude's footprint. Every path that you're on, or every path of wisdom, pretty much is going to tell you the same thing as it relates to that. Contentment should be a practice. Practice contentment. We have the Santosha, that's Sanskrit. Similar to Ma'at, it means balance. So each day you speak out loud what is already enough, give away something that has value to another person. Fast, and you don't fast to punish the body, but you're reminding your spirit that fulfillment is not found in accumulation. You start to visualize Apep collapsing into himself. You start to see his coils sort of turn inward until they begin to dissolve. You see the same sort of motion within you, in those moments where you're craving folding back into gratitude. Your appetite now becomes appreciation. The energy that once consumed, it now circulates, feeding creation instead of hoarding creation. Greed, one thing about greed, man, it promises abundance. It does. It does. But the only thing that it actually delivers to you is appetite. But generosity will promise loss to you, but it delivers to you freedom. When you can look at what you have and just whisper to yourself, this is plenty. The serpent, that sin starts to starve, so the light begins to rise, but in an unhindered sort of manner. The false dawn of greed, it glitters, but true morning, it glows, it glows. So one will blind the eye with glitter and the other will feed the soul, Gluttony. Let's get to gluttony. That's another one of the 7 deadly sins, right? I'm probably around, I think 7 now, 6 or 7. I think I got 2 more left. Gluttony is a feast of emptiness for the most part. For this, I always, when I think of gluttony, man, there's a movie that I broke down some years ago. It's on YouTube, I'm sure, somewhere. I feel like it was Blog Talk Days, but it's probably on YouTube. And it was a film by Guillermo del Toro, Pan's Labyrinth. And in that particular film, there's a creature called the Pale Man. And the Pale Man is like this bloated, ghastly person who's like seated before a banquet. And the banquet is like just stretching all the way like across the table, and it's every delicacy and it's glittering, beneath like this beautiful light. The room is silent and no one's eating. And the main character, her name was Ophelia in the movie. She's warned, don't eat the food. Like, don't touch the food when you see it. But it's not hunger that necessarily tempts her to touch the food. It's the shimmer. It's the invitation to take the food just simply because she can. So at one point she tastes one grape, and the Pale Man awakens. He starts devouring everything he was meant to guard. That table, like the way when I looked at the film, and like I said, I broke it down. It's out here somewhere. The table is the world. It's our world. And the Pale Man is gluttony, personified, right? It's the consumption that forgets consequence. Consumption that forgets consequence. Ophelia's bite is like the false dawn of indulgence. It's sweet. It's a grape. But it's a very brief sweetness and then instant danger. So every time we take beyond measure, whether it's too much pleasure, too much food, too much attention, too much entertainment, we wake up the Pale Man inside of us. In Nile Valley, offerings were meant to feed the Neteru and rebalance. So when priests began to gorge on what was meant for the Neteru, famines would always come. You had Buddha who named that craving Trishna, and Trishna was this thirst that keeps the wheel of suffering turning. In both instances, they're saying, appetite without purpose is going to eventually become a predator. So at first, your gluttony, it's going to feel like abundance, but, and we'll say, like, what's the mantra? I'm going to treat myself. I'm just treating myself. Again, I deserve it. So we fill the table up, we fill the schedule up, we fill our minds up, and the more we consume, the less we actually taste. So the false dawn now, it starts to glow warm and it looks golden, and the true morning then will reveal the cost. You're exhausted. You've wasted a bunch of stuff. Your spirit is dull now. So behind the hunger stands the same spirit that kept the Pale Man motionless, the devourer. He was motionless until temptation came into the room. But the devourer is the eater of time. And he whispers, his soft whisper is just a little more. Enjoy it. You've earned it. Take a little more. You see? So his temple is just excess, and he demands attention as a sacrifice. So he's constantly feeding on your endless snacking, whether it's, or your endless scrolling or your endless desire, until you do that, until your senses start to fall asleep. And what happens is your purpose starves. So the death that gluttony brings, is physical death and energetic death. Your body begins to slow up. Your mind becomes scattered. Your ka can't rise up. We become like the banquet hall itself. We're full, but we're lifeless. Even our joy it starts to grow heavy on us. The things that we once celebrated it turns into like sedation. And the cure for that is not denial, but is reverence. Eat as your ancestors did. where you're standing before your portion, like you're standing before an altar. Take only what you can bless. You know, take your food or what you're receiving in gratitude. Take it in silence. Take it in awareness. You know, in the Nile Valley, we had Uhum Ankh. Uhum Ankh mean the renewal of life. Uhum renews Ankh life, which is similar to like your Upsava, you know, or Upasava, to stay near the divine. That's the Sanskrit. So when you're fasting or you pause your consumption, you move closer to the source. You know, you're reminding your spirit that it lives by breath, not by bread, you know, alone, as scriptures say. So when you feel that like pale man starting to stare inside of you, when you sense like there's a reach that's coming for one more bite, one more scroll, you know, one more thrill, you know, for those of us who are thrill seekers, you know, try to remember Ophelia's lesson. One taste, you know, can awaken your own destroyer, you know, so step back, close the door, let the feast remain sacred, you know, pleasure without purpose only awakens your monsters. So discipline turns the same table into communion, you know, there's like this false dawn of gluttony that's mistaken for appetite, and it mistakes appetite for abundance. You know, so the true mourning is gratitude. That's how you defeat it. The quiet sort of fullness of your spirit, you know, that no longer needs to eat, you know, it no longer needs to eat the world for it to feel alive. You know, it consumes um, consume only what keeps the light in you awake. That's what I would say for that. Lust. You know, lust is a critical one. A lot of us deal with it. You know, it causes you to forget your song. You know, if you look at I'm gonna go to another movie. I think I just did Pan's Labyrinth. Kama Sutra. That was by Mira Nayer's film. Um, and then it said desire is art in a movie. Every gesture is sort of like painted, every glance choreographed, you know. But beneath the beauty runs a slow collapse. If you look at that film, you have Maya and Tara, and they were trading innocence for position. You know, they were trading affection for control. So they started to learn like the body's language, but they were not tied into their energetic grammar, you know, if you will. Pleasure became like a political thing, and the lessons um, tell you, just like when love seeks dominion and control, the lover becomes a servant. So lust begins as a creative spark, you know, but it's the same energy that paints, that writes, that builds, that does music, carvings, whatever, and even gives birth. So in balance, it connects the body and spirit, but in distortion, it divides body and spirit. So Maya's downfall in that movie, it isn't her passion, it's her aimlessness. You know, she wants the warmth of fire, but not its purpose. So the flame consumes her instead of refining her. You know, that particular false dawn of desire, of lust, it feels like sunrise. You know, it's got a beautiful color, it's aliveness, heart is pumping. You know, it convinces you that freedom lives in surrendering to sensation. You know, but that's a dawn. Um, it's not a morning, so that means it's light without direction. You know, morning comes only when the energy finds form, and when creation sort of remembers its song that it uses to expand creation, right? So I think like a good example for lust, even outside of the movie Kama Sutra, you know, if you think about the Anishinaabe, on the Yanishabi teachings. There's a story of Nana Bozo. That's the first man who watched animals during their mating season, and he saw their dance. And they had like this certain rhythm with the earth, right? And he wanted to join them, but the problem is he rushed in, like while they were, dancing, and he rushed in and he took action without ceremony. So the harmony broke that the animals have, and they fled, they ran off. And when that happened, like the whole land became silent. So Nana Bozo, like he was ashamed, and he learned at that moment that to honor desire through ritual, you have to ask permission of the earth first before touching what is sacred. So when he did that, then the song returned and the rhythm returned. So that particular story, from that First Nation tribe, it's not about prohibition, but it's about relationship. Desire is medicine when it's offered back to the source that gave it. You see, but sometimes we rush into our desires without respecting the ritual and the process that's supposed to come before it. When lust rules over you, you don't serve the spirit of love. You serve the spirit and the God of immediacy. That hunger that says, now, the now is all that matters right now. And that particular deity uses mirrors. It uses performers, not priests and temples. It promises that connections, but it just gives you conquest. You feel powerful. Yeah, you feel powerful in the moment, and then afterwards you feel hollow and empty. So it's the same illusion that lured Maya in Kama Sutra. The belief that being desired equals to being divine. So now what death does lust bring? Covenantal death, excuse me. Lust severs sacred bonds. It kills trust because truth can't breathe in secrecy. It kills identity because you start to shapeshift. You shapeshift to seduce people. And it kills intimacy, man. You're replacing communion with collision. So you wake up beside somebody and you feel further away from them than ever before because of lust. So whether you're looking at like the Kama Sutra or you're looking at the native teachings, the cure is the same: ceremony. The first will teach a sort of presence, breathing, rhythm, the eye, turning touch into meditation. And then the second one teaches reverence, seeing the beloved as a living aspect of the planet Earth. So when you put them together, desire is only sacred when it honors life outside itself. So before there's any sort of intimacy, pause for a second. Say a silent affirmation. May this act feed wholeness and not hunger. And you start to move slowly enough for the soul to stay inside of the body. So when passion arises, you lift it through purpose, whether it be into service or art, prayer, or union. When the body and the earth are, when they remember that they're actually relatives, lust then transforms into creation. You see? So when you're kind of stuck into the false dawn of lust, it burns red and it burns brief. So the true meaning of the morning, it's enduring. It's like this amber glow. So every act of mindful love begins to rebuild what your haste previously destroyed. So just like Nana Bozo, when you turn your desire into an offering, the song comes back, you know, and the fire will begin to warm you without wounding you. Pleasure is sacred only when it sings in harmony with creation. And the harmony that's the actual dawning after, or excuse me, the morning after. So if you think about it, the book of Coming Forth by Day, it doesn't end in the humming in the underworld. It doesn't end in the duat. It ends with emergence, you know, with the soul standing upright before the sun, you know, and that same light that judged you now welcomes you, you know, because what the seven deadly sins tend to tear down, you have what's called the seven noble virtues that build up, you know. So each death that I told you that we sort of named, it carries within it the seed of its opposite energy. You know, pride will give way to humility. Envy will give way to kindness. Wrath will transform itself into patience. Sloth can awaken diligence. You know, greed can awaken or ripen into generosity. Gluttony can soften itself into temperance. Um, Lust can eventually mature into chastity, not abstinence, but the purity of your intention. So those are remedies, man. They're not necessarily rules. They're antidotes that are distilled from the same poison that once ruled over some of us who were victims of the seven deadly sins. You know, those virtues of the morning, the disciplines that let us hold light without burning our hands. You know, so that way we begin to rise from the ashes of the seven sins. We step towards the next gate, right? The path of balance, of sacred composure, of mastery, you know. And I'm going to get into that. And I'm just giving you a teaser on the seven noble virtues. We'll get into that going into some of our next segments. You know, that's the architecture of the awakened soul, you know. So I would just say that it's important to sort of watch your mornings, you know, very closely, you know, see how the first light touches the world without envy, without greed, without pride. That's your lesson, you know, in that the sun doesn't compare itself to anything else. The sun just shines, you know. The morning after was never meant to be the ending of anything. It was meant to be the beginning of virtue, you know. So we should be, or we could be, striving to rise clean, to rise balanced, to ride luminous, and ready to build the life that light intends. You know, the sun doesn't chase sleepers. You know, it simply reveals who has made the choice to wake up. You know, so the righteous, they don't wait for the morning, they become it. You know, if you seek a companion for the next stretch of dawn, you know, I would say, you know, a good place to start too, man, to kind of understand or to help with like expanding and growing on some of these concepts, man. Read the Masnavi. I hope some of you are familiar with the Masnavi. If not, check it out. The one that was done by Jalil ad-Din Muhammad Rumi. Oftentimes just called Rumi. But I love that text, man. Like, you know, I love it. It's a Sufi book of spiritual awakenings, and it's a bunch of poetic sort of verses. But the verses, they sort of remind us that every shadow has a lamp. You know, it hides a lamp, and every true virtue that's not learned, or not every true virtue is learned, but some are just remembered through love. You know, so there was one line where Rumi wrote that I loved. The world, no, the wound is the place where the light enters you. You know, isn't that beautiful? So that's the secret of the morning after. Each of the 7 wounds that we've named is a doorway for illumination. So when we return, we walk through those doors together. You know, and we walk together into the 7 noble virtues, the disciplines of harmony, of balance, of sacred will, right? So many different ways that we could sort of let the world see the dawn through us. But, again, the greatest sunrise is the one that breaks inside of your heart. I know that may sound corny, man, but just think about how I have outlined what Ra does and what sun does, and the sacred responsibility of light, and the fullness of the coming forth of light, not just the dawn, but the actual light of the day. All right. So with that, that's what I wanted to share. I want to thank you all for listening. And I enjoyed this one. Like I said, I'm pretty sure I hit all 7. I was gonna go back and count this now, but I feel like I feel like I hit all 7. If I didn't, put it in chat. If you're like, well, what about, throw it in there. I think I did though. But like I said, this could be a very expansive segment, man. I tried to keep it kind of light for each one and give you some food that you can use right away. And like I said, eventually we'll go into the 7 noble virtues so you can see the other flip side of those coins. But, as I often teach, I like to start with what's killing me before I start with what's healing me and making me feel better or helping my self-esteem. What is it in my culture, or my philosophy, or my society that's taken from me first? So I think the 7 deadly sins is it's a great start for many of us. And like I said, I was excited to be able to present that information to you, and willfully, as always, spark something. If it did, make sure you like the video, share the video. As I said last strong, if you're not subscribed to the channel, make sure you get subscribed. And if you think you're subscribed, double check and make sure you are subscribed. Because guess what? After last strong, and I said that, who got some inboxes and said, you know what, Chief, I was unsubscribed. I subscribed years ago, and it told you. I don't say told you so, but yeah. So just make sure you subscribe, and if you got more than one account, subscribe from the other one too, and make sure you hit the bell notification as well. All right. So I want to thank you for riding with me this time. This was wonderful. I enjoyed this a lot, being able to, because I think this will help some of you who are struggling, in these areas, and a lot of people are struggling with pride and greed and lust and sloth and, and gluttony and, all of these different, and jealousy, these different, or envy rather, these different emotions that, you may not be aware of, that like it's a spiritual thing, and you're locking yourself into certain, temples of particular deities, and you may just think, well, I just got a little issue with this. You may not realize how you're feeding it, and how it's very intentional for you to have that issue and to keep said issue. All right. So I will that this was very helpful for you in that sense. All right. Until such time, thank you so much for coming through. Make sure you check out the ANU Nation, all the free offerings that we have on the store. The Sabbath guide, the Mikveh guide. I got some more coming up as well. But even the Shekinah guide that you can get for free as well. You just join the newsletter. All right. So make sure you're tuned in and locked in on our readings. And the ANU Way is also free. So you can be in step with the language, the lingo, the swag, and the vision. All right. Shalom.